Learning strategies. Let's face it, a huge part of graduate school is attending class, learning the material, and it isn't easy. So what can we do about that? So I want to talk about first your experience in the classroom, maybe some habits that you should have in the classroom, study techniques and things you should do outside of the classroom, my advice on how to handle homework, and then finally advice on exams and final exams. In the classroom, attend every lecture. Don't ever miss lectures. Now, I understand you can get sick. Maybe you have to go away on a job interview or attend a conference. I think those are valid excuses. But if you're too tired that day or something else rather inconsequential, don't let yourself get there. Attend every possible lecture that you can. I was in college for a total of about 16 years. I entered in 1990 and finally finished in 2006. And I can say in my entire time, I think I missed 3 lectures. And 2 of those were for like conferences, job interview kind of things. And I can't remember the first one. But I remember being deathly ill and still going to lecture. Now, I'm probably a little bit more extreme this way than you need to be. But I think it gives you an idea of where I'm coming from. I think you want to arrive early to get seated, and perhaps you can get the better seat. Some professors have a soft voice or they're hard to understand, and maybe you want to get to the front. So arrive early for that. Do what you can to prepare for class. Maybe that's reviewing your notes or if there was any videos that you should watch, but always come prepared with paper, pencil, calculator, whatever it is you need. So be sure you have all those things so you can participate in whatever class activity that there is. You definitely want to turn off all of your electronic devices for 2 reasons. One, you don't want to disturb the class, but also you don't want to disturb yourself, right? If your phone vibrates, well, you're going to want to check your text messages and then you're not listening to class. And it's going to be irritating to the professor. I think you also want to listen for the high level organization of the material. You might not even be thinking to listen for that, but if the lecture is super confusing, you at least want to come away with the topics that was discussed because then you can go study and fill those in for yourself. So always listen for high level organization. And then pay attention and don't be the distraction. There's always going to be other distractions, construction outside, other students that are talking or whatever, but don't you yourself be that distraction. Plus it's going to put you on the professor's naughty list and you don't want to be there. Notes. I recommend using a separate notebook for each class. Now, maybe you go with one notebook, you take all your notes in that, but then you separate them at the end of the day. And I think that helps us mentally, just that organization of keeping all of the notes separate. I also think you should start each lecture with a new piece of paper. And at the top, you're going to write the date, you're going to have the topic or whatever other kind of introductory information, but start with a new fresh piece of paper. Don't continue from the other one. And that's also because I'm going to suggest some ways that you can organize your notes later. So always start with a new piece of paper. Take as good and clean of notes as you can. And if for some reason things are moving so quickly, try to write down the bare minimum and then as soon as you can, fill in your notes after class. And in fact, that's the next bullet here. And a huge one that I did, particularly for the classes that I struggled the most with, I would do my best to take notes, but I would err on the side of listening over taking notes. And then afterward, I would rewrite my notes and I would write them better and cleaner and more organized and supplement for things from the textbook or other books and fill in details and derivations that were maybe done sparsely in class. And I'll talk more about that. Another thing that helped me is at the end of the lecture, I'd rewrite my notes. Consider making a 1-page summary of all the information that was in that lecture. So when it comes time to review, you don't have to go page after page after page to figure out where things were. You could just look at your 1-page summaries. Now, I only did that for my toughest classes. Study techniques. So these are things outside the classroom that you can do. First, when should you study what? Now they say, and who is they? I don't know. They say Study new concepts in the morning and memorization in the evenings. So I guess we're more open to new things. We're more creative in the mornings. I also think there's such a thing as night owls, where maybe that's reversed. So think about that for yourself. But I can say definitely for me, I think this is pretty close to true. Another thing about when to study well ahead of exams. It's a common thing to sort of do an all-nighter before an exam, and are you really learning the information that well? At most, you're cramming stuff into your short-term memory, but you're also attending the test tired. And I think it's better to study slower and earlier, because then it's putting it in your long-term memory, which will make it easier later in the semester. But you're also not tired before the exam, and not being tired will help your memory recall. So always study well ahead of time. In fact, I can say in my entire 16 years of college, I never once pulled an all-nighter studying. Visit the professor during their office hours. I think this is always good practice. But I wouldn't just stop by unannounced, because that could be irritating to some. So stop by their office hours. If they invite you to stop by anytime, by all means do that. But seek help, and seek help early. If you have an assignment, it's really tough, don't hesitate to go see the professor. They will actually enjoy this and enjoy seeing you, or at least the good professors. But don't approach them the day before the homework assignment is due, that you're stuck and you don't even know how to get the first problem done. So literally in the first day or two that the assignment is assigned, give it a try. Identify what's hard, what's not. Give it a good try to work through it, but then seek help early. When you're visiting the professor, be friendly and don't waste their time. If you're the type that's constantly stopping by and talking about sports and movies, some professors may enjoy this, but you're going to be taking up time from other students. Professors have a lot to get done, and I think they're going to be very polite. They're going to talk to you, but you could be wasting their time and frustrating them. So be respectful of their time. But another whole part of this, and maybe this is more of a psychological trick here, is you would like to make yourself memorable in a positive way. And, you know, professors are people too, and we are vulnerable to psychological tricks and hacks. But if you make yourself memorable, very often you will get favorable treatment on grading. It is really tough to avoid. I've actually completely revamped how I do my grading to try to eliminate my own bias that way. And I essentially had to simplify it so it's an easier choice based on what mistakes are made, what to grade it. But not all professors grade that way. And I think the more memorable you make yourself, the greater your chances are of getting favor from that professor. To memorize things, you can use mnemonics. In electrical engineering, we had these color codes on resistors. And, well, how do you remember that black is 0, brown is 1, red is 2? How do you remember that? Well, you can make a sentence out of it. Bright boys rave over young girls, but veto getting wed. Kind of funny, but it's catchy, and then you can memorize that. So a lot of times you have to memorize things. You can make sentences or pictures out of it. I think flashcards are great. You can summarize a whole topic on a flashcard. I guess you can't summarize too much, but then you can also turn it into a game. And if you have study groups, or maybe you're studying with some of your friends, they could just test you on the flashcards. You can carry them with you and look them over when you just find yourself sitting there waiting for somebody. So I think flashcards are another good way to memorize things. I am personally not a big fan of memorization. I think because I have a very weak and poor memory. I'm not entirely sure why, but it's one of my many weaknesses. So when I make exams, I always try to allow students to have cheat sheets and things like that, as opposed to having to memorize. But some professors insist on memorizing, and, well, here's one good trick of how to get things memorized. Rewriting of notes. I found this particularly helpful for me. This was particularly good for really hard classes, or classes I had a very poor professor. Maybe I couldn't understand what they were saying or writing, and all I could do was like barely capture the high-level topics that they were doing. So here's an example of what my notes might look like in the class. And I'm writing quickly too. Like, this is sloppy. I can barely read my own writing. But I'll come away, and as soon as I can after that class is over, I'm going to rewrite that. and I might produce something that looks like this. So I'm going through the topics. I'm probably looking at my textbook, maybe notes that came later or in previous lectures, and I'm supplementing things, and I'm essentially writing how the notes should have been. So this was huge for me, and I recommend doing that. So if you are rewriting notes, here's what I found helpful: to rewrite the notes as immediately as possible after class, because this is when you're going to have the most memory of what on earth was talked about, because you may not have taken notes on everything. But you want to take this opportunity to clean up your writing. Maybe you were writing very quickly during class. Well, now you can write more slowly. You can better organize the information. If you have a textbook or internet or other sort of resources you can pull from, you can get supplemental information, fill in gaps. Maybe the professor did some kind of derivation and skipped a bunch of steps. Well, you can go ahead and fill in those steps. I also liked, for the particularly hard classes or where we just covered a lot of stuff, at the end of the lecture, I'd rewrite my notes, but I would make a one-page summary of everything in that lecture. Now, when it came time to study, all I would really have to is look at those one-page summaries to know what that set of notes contained, and that actually really helped me. So this one-page summary of notes. Here's a good example. Here's some notes that I did for my four-year optics class, and this was rewritten notes. I tend not to write this neatly. I tend to write like a first grader when I'm taking notes, and so I rewrote them. But still there's a lot of information there. So I went ahead and I created a one-page summary. And I did this for every single one of my lectures that I attended. And this worked really well for me. And I could really study just from those one-page summaries. Another thing you could do in a similar way, rather than summarize a lecture, maybe there's a topic that you learned as part of a lecture or over multiple lectures, but create a one-page summary of that. And I'm a huge fan of doing this all on a single page, not going to 2 pages or even a page and a half or even on the back side. And for me, as I mentioned, one of my big weaknesses is memory. I like to tell people I have a photographic memory, because if I don't have a picture of it, I can't remember it. And so it's very important for me to summarize all of the information about a particular subject on one side. And if you peruse the course websites I've created, you'll actually see a lot of these summaries out there. These weren't necessarily the ones I created as a student. This was a habit I fell into in my later years that I wish I had discovered earlier. But the summaries maybe I wish I would have had, or that's I make available to the students that I teach now. But can you do a one-page summary that contains all the necessary information to solve problems? This particular one's on propagating uncertainty. So, imagine you're shipwrecked on a desert island and you have to solve a propagating uncertainty problem in order to get off the island. And all you have is one page. What would you want on that one page? And having it all on one page, in my mind, it helps me remember it because I can see all the information. And I'm not sure what the mechanism is in my brain, but I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say other people are like me, and seeing it on one page and not on multiple pages will help you memorize and kind of map out information. A great place to include supplementary information. And what I'll do is I'll have a summary of a topic, and maybe if there's a real key equation that has a nice derivation behind it, I will staple pages behind this that contain those derivations or contain maybe examples or other sorts of things. But it's important that it's all summarized on one page for me. Study groups. In the beginning, before I really knew the game with study groups, they were never productive for me. It was always people showing up who didn't do their homework, and they're really just there to copy my homework or other people's homework and not actually study. And so study groups were not effective, or very often they would, become a social group and then nobody does any studying. That was particularly, the social part was particularly bad sort of in the beginning of my undergraduate years. I think, by the time you get to junior, senior, and graduate level, that your study groups turning into socials probably less of an issue. but I do always think you'll have the problem with people showing up just to copy problems and not actually study. So be cautious about that. So the way I did this is I never depended on a study group to study. In fact, I would always study ahead of time, and I learned how to study on myself. But what I did find is I would go to these study groups after I've already studied and help people. That was super rewarding because now I'm teaching the subject. That started helping me develop my teaching skills. I'm helping people. But also when you teach a subject, you actually learn it better. And they'll ask questions, oh, I didn't really think about that. And then you go ahead and you figure that out. But I always did my homework and stuff ahead of time. I'd show up and say, yeah, I haven't gotten to the homework yet, even though maybe I had. And I would help them study, maybe help them do their homework. And that always worked out really well. And I learned the information better in the end having taught it. But I definitely wouldn't just provide your homework to others for them to copy. That's not helping them. And it could be hurting you. On to homework. I think the best way to do homework is to do the homework for yourself and not the professor. The professor probably lays out some minimum requirements of your homework, but for me, every time I did homework, I really did it much more for myself. So imagine 10 years from now, you take the class, but 10 years from now, you're going to be lost on a desert island and you're going to need this information to get off that island. And all you have is your homework. What would you want your homework to look like? This island I keep talking about is pretty vicious. But what do you want in your homework in order to get off this island? So I recommend going overboard on the graphics you generate, the formatting, the explanations you provide. I don't know why I remember this particular one, but it was a homework assignment on a Hilbert transform. And when I was learning that, I figured out that a Hilbert transform is very close to a derivative operation. Not exactly, but very close. And there's a little derivation of that, of how you can approximate it as just a derivative. And I wrote a little thing in my homework. And actually, the instructor loved that. I didn't do it for the instructor. I did it for me to just try to help me picture really what's going on. So be neat and methodical in your homework. I think the more methodical you are, the more it reinforces the thought process that you're going through. And rather than just, like if you're deriving something, rather than just write equation after equation after equation, put some words in about what you're doing from step to step. Definitely get started on your homework early. Recognize if there's something super tough in that homework. And if you are stuck on it, don't let yourself get stuck too long. Very often you only have a week or so to do that homework. Go see the instructor early in their office. Don't wait till the day before the assignment's due or the morning of. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. Now, if I've given a homework and I suddenly start seeing a lot of students come to my office early and they're stuck, you know what? I may actually extend the due date and realize I maybe made this a little bit tougher than I should. But if they're all coming to me the morning before it's due, I never did that. And that's probably pretty common amongst professors. So go early. What to keep in mind for college is that every hour in the classroom, I think, requires at least 3 hours of study and doing homework outside the classroom. So budget your time that way. If you don't have that time, maybe you need to take fewer classes in a semester. For me, when I was in graduate school, I had a full-time job on the side, so I could only do one class at a time. Now, that really stretched things out. It actually took me 11 years to get my PhD, simply because I was working full-time during the vast majority of that. But think of the 1-to-3 ratio, and don't overbook it. Don't get anxious to finish your courses so you're going to overload in the semester, because that can really exhaust you. I did that one time. I swore I'd never do it again, and I didn't. Also, take frequent breaks. I don't know what ratio works for you, but you could think, work for 20 minutes, take a 5-minute break or something like that. And even if you're going strong and you feel great, hey, I don't need a break, take the break anyway, because if you get to the point where you're exhausted before you take a break, it's going to take you longer to come back from that exhaustion. So take frequent breaks, even if you think you don't need it. A great time to work on these summaries is when you are studying. I like making my cheat sheets. I really like the idea of a cheat sheet. One, because It eliminates a lot of stress on the exam because the memorization aspect goes away. But just making the cheat sheet is going to help you remember stuff and remember the organization of the information. So there's multiple reasons why I always have students be allowed cheat sheets. I want to reduce the stress. I'm not a big fan of memorization. And in the end, they actually remember the material better having made those cheat sheets. Let's talk about exams, particularly the final exams. So one thing I did, and the first time I did this, it was very counterintuitive and it was almost magical, but I would calculate what I needed on each final exam to get an A in the class. And this was actually particularly helpful in my undergraduate years because sometimes I would have a really tough class, but I'd have maybe a 98, 99 average going into the final exam and realize I only need like a C on the final to get an A in the class. And even though it was my toughest class, I realized, well, I would barely have to study to get a C. But other classes, maybe I'd have to get an 85 or something in order to get an A in the class. And so I would devote my study time to that. In the end, at most universities, it's just an A. So a 90 is the same as a 100. And so I budgeted my study time that way. And so you devote more time to the classes that are needing the higher grade. And don't just base it on the difficulty of the material. And this was what was really counterintuitive for me. Had I not done this, I probably would have been studying on those really difficult classes, not realizing that maybe I only needed a C or a D on the final to get an A because I had such a high grade going into it. Cheat sheets. If you're allowed a cheat sheet, and I would encourage your professors to allow that because they can just create the exams and tests that accommodate you having a cheat sheet. But work on creating a very excellent cheat sheet because you're going to learn a lot doing that. Try to organize and lay out the information so you can see it all at once. Now, if you've been making the one-page summaries like I recommended, then you already probably have pictures and ways to summarize things already figured out, and you can put that directly on your cheat sheets. I like doing my cheat sheets not necessarily by hand, but laying them out on a computer so I can print multiple copies. Some professors collect the cheat sheets. I don't know why they do that. Because for me, I tell them they can have anything they want to on that cheat sheet. It just has to fit onto, both sides of an 8.5 by 11. And I don't personally see a need to collect it, but I think that's a shame because you can put a lot of effort into that. And a lot of professors do for some crazy reason. So if you do it on a computer, you can just print yourself out another cheat sheet if you still want that. So I'm a big fan of cheat sheets. The whole one-page summary kind of thing, that was huge for me, and it helped me overcome my lack of memory.